Thank you. Hello, my name is Rania. I'm a Director of AI Engineering at IBM Research AI. I work down the street in Bini, in Kendall Square. So today I'm here to talk about humans and AI and the implications of applying AI. Where is it? If this will, no AI here. We'll go old-fashioned. Where is it? Oh, that's true here.
Sorry.
Where does it go?
Technical. I'm not a technical person. Everybody knows that. There we go.
All right, thank you. So there are certain things that humans are really good at, and there are certain things that machines are really good at. And these two are quite complementary, and we believe that you can get the best when you combine humans and machines together. So taking this view of augmenting humans, not replacing humans, is one really important point of view, and we think we can go quite far in that. If we look at what's happening today, this is actually a year old. I'm sure the numbers are much larger now. But the amount of data being generated today is really, really high. And the amount of information that's embedded in this data is very valuable potentially if found in the right way and used in the right way. But a lot of it's also junk, right? So the advent of cognitive systems was to enable machines to understand, to reason, and to learn so that they can help us be better at what we need to do. Some of you have heard a lot about deep learning now. It's all the rage. So one thing is that the algorithms are really not new. They're about 30 years old. But right now, finally, there is enough data that you can train these big neural networks. And computers are fast enough that you can actually complete the training in a reasonable amount of time, which you could not do before. So that's one of the reasons this is all the rage right now. A very interesting thing about it, however, is that people don't quite understand why neural networks do what they do. It's a black box. You train it on a lot of data until it starts generating the answers that you want, and then you just don't touch it for a while. But it has been able to do some very interesting things and enable some breakthroughs. So here in this example, we worked on combining deep learning on images with deep learning on text and combining them together to improve image captioning. And these algorithms for captioning, as you can see, they were suddenly able to label images that have very unusual situations in them, like a boat in front of a building or a lady with a giraffe behind her, and they do reasonably well. If we look at how technology is changing, so how does this apply and where do you apply it? If we look at how technology is changing, in the world of web apps, a few years back, the point was to use technology to automate the world. I think we just heard about manufacturing jobs and so on, where the idea was to replace. And to automate. So there we had things like transaction processing and web applications. But now with the emergence of AI, you need these machines to understand the world better. So we're applying machine learning to get patterns out of data. You can do object recognition to understand what's in images so you can act better on it. Do speech analytics for dialogue, understand different relationships and interactions between things. As we move into this new era, I think one thing to keep in mind also is that there is a lot of hype around AI, and some of the companies doing it need a lot of data to do it, and they have a lot of data to do it, but a lot of it is being done in the consumer space. So, right, if I'm a Facebook or a Google, right, I have all of YouTube or I have everybody's Google photos, I can do a lot with that data. But if I am wrong, like if I think, Susie is me and I'm Susie for the point of view of, who was at the party last night, that's kind of okay. But if you're in a business setting and you make that mistake and something like, for example, that's trying to identify who is more likely to default on a loan, right, for example, right, then a mistake there is much more costly and has different repercussions. Additionally, the problem domain is very different and it's much harder. So if we look at one of the famous examples that came out was being able to work with the London Underground and go plan your trips and know if things are happening with the trips, if there were changes, or compare, figure out the optimal path. That's a very closed world system. If we look in the business domain, one example was we worked with H&R Block around taxes, right? So, understanding the map of the London Underground versus understanding the US tax code, the magnitude and the complexity is significantly different. And a schedule change in one versus a tax change in the other, or the potential of one and the implications it could have. So the algorithms are drastically harder, and the problems that we face getting the model created and designed are quite different. So at IBM, we are targeting AI for the enterprise, AI for business, and we focus very much on these kinds of challenges. Let's look at a few examples, and I'm going to show a couple of these, mainly on healthcare and media. In healthcare, the folks at the Barrow Neurological Institute used Watson to understand how to fight ALS. So they consumed a very large amount of published medical literature about it, and they ranked nearly 1,500 genes in the human genome to predict what could be associated with ALS. And they found that 9 out of the 10 genes that were proposed by the computer were to be linked by the disease, whereas I think they had only known about 5 of them earlier, right? So they were able to discover new potential genes that could be linked to ALS. And some of them had never been linked to the disease before. Here's a more fun example, not so serious. This work was done for the masters and looking at highlights. So we did analytics on video and sound from the masters to try to detect cool moments, like the highlights, and let you be able to categorize them and replay them so you could just watch the fun parts easily. So you see, so usually there isn't the volume maybe, but where is it here? Anyway, you can hear the crowd cheer. And so in this example, right, you can see there's a lot of crowd cheering and a lot of activity, and overall we think the excitement level is quite high. So it picks out of the whole video these snippets that you might be most likely interested in. Here's one more use of AI, which is trying to understand what is on a shelf in a supermarket. It's for planograms, right? Like trying to figure out where you were supposed to put the things so that you follow the design required by your supermarket. And some of the interesting thing about the algorithms used here is they use a very small amount of data to train, which is something that we find in enterprises, which is the amount of labeled data in your enterprise is much, much smaller than the amount of labeled data in consumer AI, where everybody's giving. Now? Yeah. There's nowhere to hang it on a dress. This is bias in technology. Having talked about its use in business, I think we'd like to spend a couple of moments talking about how you can also use AI for social good. We started a program in IBM Research called Science for Social Good, and we work with not-for-profits to solve interesting problems for society using machine learning. We think this has been very valuable because often the scientists don't find the real problems, the machine learning scientists, and then lots of the people that are facing these real problems with boots on the ground, they don't have the skills to solve the problems. So through this program, we are matching our top researchers with nonprofits on the ground, and I'll go through some of the ways that we are using AI to solve interesting problems. So over 700,000 children die of diarrhea, and it's very preventable. There's this pack. It's like you put it in water, and it costs less than 50 cents. But when we were approached by a nonprofit that explained to us that in Kenya, a lot of the small medical shops, they don't even know that this thing exists in the villages. So what we did was we worked with them to understand the buying patterns of people and recommend an approach for educating both the consumers and these folks in the medical shops to how to better educate and provide the availability of these hydration salt packs. Another example was we also worked with the Carey Institute on the hunt for Zika with machine learning. And there, the problem was to try to figure out how to prevent the spread of Zika, and only very few animals are carriers. So we did some work to analyze the characteristics of animals that are carriers to try to predict what other species could also be carriers of Zika, so to help them design their prevention protocols. And the last example in this thread is on preventing opioid addiction. So I think many of us here have heard on the opioid epidemic, so I won't go too much into that. But it's been quite disturbing. A lot of people got into this because they were prescribed some medication by their doctor and then couldn't stop taking it. So we did some analytics on insurance claims and prescriptions for opioids, and what we determined was that it wasn't really how much was prescribed, but it was more the length it was prescribed for, the first prescription, right? The number of days that you had it was a big determining factor in whether or not someone was likely to become addicted to it or not. So these are some examples of some of the areas where we have been working on social good for AI, and we can have a real profound impact. From here, fun things. So, okay, we said some great things, but I know people are worried, right? AI is going to take my job, and some bad things are going to happen. The machine is going to take over. We see 3 dimensions where people get worried, right? And for in some cases, for good cause. So one is, what are the societal implications? Is the world ready? If I go to the doctor and it says, oh, I think you're going to get cancer, and I say, okay, why? And they say, well, the machine said it. And they can't explain why. That's a problem. And then what does my insurance do now? Because the insurance maybe has not caught up with what should be the process. Are extra tests covered or not if there isn't a real diagnosis? So there are all these societal implications that come about from the use of AI, that have a policy and procedure that need to catch up. Second is the transparency and trust with companies. So do I trust Google with all my photos, even though they provide it for free? Do I trust when they say they will do no harm? Or do I trust IBM with my data if I'm a corporation? So and what are the ethics of the company? That's been coming up a lot. And finally, the ethical behavior of the AI systems. I think that's the one that a lot of people worried about, how fast AI could progress, worry about, which is, does the agent or the robot, what are the ethics of that entity, and how does that do? And I think across all these, there's a worry about bias. So we've, maybe some of you may have heard that some algorithms were, biasing very heavily just based on gender or just based on age. And that's really worrisome because, again, that has implications all around. However, the silver lining is that we can apply AI to the AI systems to improve their outcomes. So we've done some work on cleaning data appropriately before it's used in an algorithm to debias it. You can put some checks in place to understand what it's doing to warn you if things are doing better or worse. And in some cases, it might be better than a human. So if you have a human doing an interview process, maybe they bring their own biases, but you can use algorithms to help ameliorate that. There's also been quite a bit of work about trying to get better at understanding what neural networks are doing. We're not there yet, but there's quite a bit of work trying to visualize their behavior, dissect networks to understand what part of a network is responsible for what decision or what part of the solution. And there's a lot of interesting research in this field here. And really, the state of the art today, it's still really not, it's still pretty basic what these things can do, right? They're really not doing much on their own yet. But so in terms of, some folks are worried, are machines taking over the world? Are we close to the singularity? We're very far from that. But there are real interesting implications about how algorithms are used. And often, if you take an algorithm that was designed to like detect a face for a fun thing, and someone just says, oh, I can do here, this one can detect faces, and I go and I use it in, I'm Middle Eastern, right? So if someone goes and uses it to like pull me out of a line in an airport because I look a certain way, that has implications for me that I don't really like. So it's important that there are some guidelines put around, I think, algorithms or models that are built to understand, what is the cost of this being wrong, or right, that impacts how they get used, so that there's some accountability in the use of the AI system as people are able to compose out of existing models and other people's models. At IBM, this is very close to our heart. We were one of the founding members of the Partnership on AI, whose purpose is to share the best practice, develop and share the best practices for using AI responsibly. This has grown to 54 partners today. We also recently published this January our guidelines around the use of cognitive technologies, which lays out how IBM will use your data and the principles that we will follow when we use AI in IBM and by IBM. So we take this very seriously, and I think there's a lot we can do there. So in conclusion, I end with Alan Turing, who said that the search for new techniques must be regarded as carried out by the human community as a whole. And we really need to think of how we can use AI to help us, and not be too afraid of it, but put the checks and balances in place so that we can use it responsibly and develop it well. Thank you.
Oh, the hands went up very quickly. Hold on, too fast.
Can you explain to a layperson, I used to have a background in AI, I realize I have no understanding of the world today. We know certain things about these algorithms. We know that there's limits on how far they can go. We also know they may go beyond where the human brain can understand. Like there was a thing about Eureka, which is a learning system. They fed it a lot of cellular respiration or cellular, how cells upregulate, downregulate work, and it spit out a 40-page equation about this is how cells work, but no one can figure out
why.
Like the equation appears to hold, but no one can understand what's underpinning that. So where do we get to a point where there's no meta framework where our frame, we can't understand it anymore? So is there a theory or body of work? Are we looking at this right? I mean, how does a layperson think about this? And so we go to a dinner party, we can sound smart.
That's a very good question. I think, so this is, in deep learning, people don't know why it's doing it, right? So there's two ways that's being handled. One is some domains are saying, no, like you can't use those algorithms. If they're not understandable algorithms that we can regulate, you cannot use them as part of a decision system in particular domains. That happens in some medical domains, right? So some people have been able to use them for pets, but not for humans, right? So on the other hand, there is science going on to try to understand the mathematics better, right? To see if they are interpretable or pieces of them could be interpretable. And then on the other hand, so there are people looking into this. It's called interpretability in machine learning and interpretability. It's it's an active research field, especially for deep neural networks, because those are really black boxes today. However, one thing that came up recently, we were having a discussion, I think was interesting, was about, let's look at how people do drug testing today. You can do a trial, like you do some science, but then you do a trial and kind of you see it works generally, and then maybe you approve it. You're not sure exactly why it's working. So there was some discussion of, would that happen for AI too at some point? Would there be something where if you could do some kind of trial, you could still pass some certification even though nobody really knows why the algorithm is doing what it is? I really don't know. It is a disturbing, it is a bit unsettling thought, right? No. Oh, sorry.
I was going to use the Go example.
Yeah, Go.
I was going to use the. Yeah. Hello. So the first version of Go, where AI beat the expert,
yes.
Was a trained trained somewhat by a human a little bit. The second version
0.
was 0, and the machine learned all by itself, and as I think John Landry mentioned earlier, I mean, came up with its own moves that humans had never obviously seen before. So will the interpretation of AI, will it be able to go into that second version and figure out
What
at
it
some
learned.
point what it did?
What it did, yeah. I think it might be able to go in and figure out eventually what it did, but the problem is, would you ever be able to learn, can you apply that to a human or know better than it? Because the amount of computation you can now do, especially in these, in like a cloud data center where you can just add as many nodes as you have, for example, we're not going to be able to match that. So how do you do it with checks and balances, and how do you do it in a way that augments the humans and doesn't run off on its own? But I think it's also about what they are learning. So they're learning no one's been able to do something like this outside of games, right? So they're very, very closed systems with a lot of constraints, right? Being able to generalize out of that is a very, very hard problem. So we are still really in early days, I think.
So I'm going to try to answer Jim's question for how I try to sound smart at dinner parties about AI, and then ask you a question about what we really need to do. And it was talking to an AI professional who employs hundreds of PhDs working on AI, and what she said to me is, hey, we've started hiring a whole lot of anthropologists. And I went, anthropologists, why? She said, well, because what we're trying to do is understand the attributes of culture so that we can then have the machine understand attributes of culture that we want to transmit. And I thought, well, that will at least make me sound smarter than the average bear. And so that's the starting point. But then, well, what is it? How can we discuss who gets to be in the discussion about which culture and which attributes of culture are going to be included? And I saw your big slide of having a big consortium try to talk about this, but what will be the mechanism for bringing the conversation out in a way that people feel included, instead of that it's somehow magic and that people are in a room deciding things for us?
That's very interesting. And I think just trying to get more diverse data sets. I think you bring up several issues, right? One is you need more diverse data sets that are global and not only from the countries that have enough money that are doing this kind of research, maybe, right? Or have enough technology to gather that data from the people that they can reach. So that's one part of the problem. But another part of the problem is the folks training these machines, right, are going to bias to themselves. So we are seeing a little more of what you're describing. Like in my team, I have some social scientists and psychologists that work with us on the human factors in AI. But there was an interesting discussion because people were deciding about ethics in AI and how do you de-bias or train the system not to pick up on bias. There was some chatbot that you said something to it and it returned a very negative sentiment to something that it should not have. And the discussion there was, well, do you want to see what's in the data that it was given, or do you want to see what lines up with your values? And those are two very different things. In one case, the answer was right because the statistics are telling you what was in the data that was given. On the other hand, if this is a chatbot that everyone's interacting with, you want it to have the agreed upon values of where you are. And there it got into what I thought was quite interesting, where I think we all have some set of common values, and then based on culture or globalization or even pockets of where you are, it started getting into a discussion that's a bit of a discussion. You hear about people about different ways of raising kids, right? Like it can get very philosophical. What values are you going to teach the bot was where we ended up in the end. So I think that's also very interesting because there isn't a universal. There are some universal things we all agree, right? Don't discriminate on gender, on race, on and so forth. But in some cases, for example, I was talking to someone from India, and she was telling me that if you're Indian, you're much more susceptible to reactions to a particular kind of drug. But all the studies are done on on white men, right? So then they'll never figure out that, if you're Indian, you're more likely to have a reaction unless there's a study done there. But to get through the FDA process, you're more likely if you just do it on white men, even if you know, right? Because you'll have better success rate. So there, in some cases, where in one case you could say, well, don't put the ethnicity in your data because that biases the data. But on the other hand, you really want to know when you're doing the study the ethnicity of in this case, of the patient, so that you can detect the pattern that there is an adverse reaction, right? So it's really not black and white. And as you say, the standards are not there. No, it's still such a new area. And with AI, what's really interesting is that it's so dependent on the results are so dependent on what manipulations people did to the data. It's so dependent to that. And that is specific to the use case. The same data set used in different places can have really bad reactions because people took out important features when they were cleaning it, right? That may then matter later.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, there are outputs from AI data that the human can't comprehend. And I'm going to assume that no matter how well you program your data or inputs, the humanness of people is hard for the AI to understand, to get that in as data, because it's just not possible to come up and calculate all the possible combinations of human existence.
Yes, yes, I completely agree. And what makes, there was this, what was it called, Sophia? This robot that Saudi Arabia gave citizenship to. Did you see that? It's weird. I was watching a video interview with her yesterday, and people are getting. It's interesting what these agents can do, but it's really, again, you're modeling. It's very specific how you're teaching them, and they can only do a certain thing if you ask the right set of questions in the right order, right? But it is very far, and really people are very different, and depending also how you grew up and where you are and which country you're from, right? How you sound. So I think we're a long ways from that. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Rania.